I would just say, one reflection on all of the different speakers, and I thought there was a great deal of consistency in what we were saying. Different countries, but similar ideas about trying to not just manage the crisis and look for ways to stabilize it and to incentivize North Korea to think twice about what it's doing, but also the longer-term strategy of trying to establish greater understanding among the 5 countries about the middle term, about the medium and long term, what the what the region would look like, what we would imagine a denuclearized peninsula would be. I think there was great agreement that there is not a vision of a single country right away. Indeed, we might all be happy to live with 2 Koreas, but ones that are at peace with each other and that are not arming themselves for nuclear war. And then I think also this notion of sharing through dialogue and pre-preparation how our countries would deal with different contingencies. If there were a collapse of the North Korean regime, if there were other outcomes, how would we work together so that we don't, as Professor Jha has said, we don't bump into each other when we're in North Korea trying to lock down and secure the nuclear materials. So there's a general agenda, I think, of not just coping with the crisis, but thinking about the longer term. And to the extent we have more common understanding of where we're trying to go, it will give us all more confidence that multilateral sanctions and multilateral carrots and sticks can be sustained at a sufficient level that we can hope for, under those conditions, some rethinking in North Korea. So I think there is a theme there, and that's what I have gotten out of this first round more than anything else.
I think in South Korea, there are a lot of, probably also in other countries, a lot of people who argue that China should step up the sanctions, better to cut off oil altogether, oil supply to North Korea, and thinking that this is a way to solve the problem, okay? And thinking that this is a peaceful way to solve the problem. Probably we need to reflect on this kind of thinking, okay? Because it's a difficult decision for China to do that, because it may touch off a crisis in North Korea. And a crisis in North Korea may lead to military conflict. Okay? So people, who argue that China should cut off oil altogether and then do the tougher sanctions, they think that this is a peaceful option. But I think we should be aware of non-peaceful consequences. So it's not probably not right to blame China for not taking that kind of approach. Especially this understanding is very striking in Seoul. When you talk to people, they say we are against military option, but we are for stronger sanctions. Especially, it's better for China to cut off oil supply to North Korea altogether. Okay. But this is a self-contradictory kind of argument, okay? Because a so-called peaceful option can also become a military option. Okay?
We're not blaming China. This is a case of engagement. We are aware that that energy sanctions would have a critical impact, can destabilize not only North Korea but China. So should we request China to do that, we need more international engagement, and that was exactly what I was talking about before. And to work on contingency planning with China and others nations involved. About nuclear, development. Very briefly, this is really not an issue of international law or institution. This is essentially an issue about the availability of materials, resources, and technological levels. And I dare say, and I'm not happy saying that, there is quite a large amount of plutonium available in Japan at this moment. And some of that has been sent out of Japan under Prime Minister Abe, but I believe that there's quite a few available, which means that Japan is actually material based in a pretty good position to develop nuclear weapons, in fact much easier than South Korea. That does not mean that we should, and I very strongly resent and exaggerate the discussions on this matter, but just the material grounds. Thank you.
I must say that I've attended many discussions on the Korean issue in the course of my life, and this is one of the best discussions that I've heard so far. And the level of candor is quite amazing in terms of the options. And at the same time, I must say, amazing and also frightening, because it's clear that the military option, which I said should be off the table, is not that far away and could actually happen either intentionally or unintentionally. So therefore, I think we need to step up the efforts to make sure that that military solution doesn't happen. And here, 2 points. One, you asked me why is North Korea developing ICBMs? The simple answer to that, and it's actually documented in Fu Ying's book, their concern of North Korea is not national security, it's regime security. I agree. What threatens their regime most of all? They believe that some kind of intervention on the part of the United States, as it has in other places, could lead to regime collapse. So the ICBMs are a direct effort to gain regime security. And that's why they're doing it. It's not for national security, it's for regime security. But the other key point here is that while I agree with Chia Ching-kuo that the carrot must be, a stronger carrot must go along with a bigger stick with North Korea, and certainly an assurance by United States towards not intervening in North Korea would be helpful. To be completely candid, the second point is this: any solution to the Korean Peninsula, it's very important that the level of trust between United States and China must be very high, because there's a very clear correlation. The higher the level of trust between US and China, the greater the likelihood of a solution to the Korean Peninsula. The lower the level of trust, the lower the level of likelihood. And here, if I can add one more idea to the idea of a carrot to solve this problem. And this is not my idea, by the way. I didn't think about it. I have to give credit to whoever suggested it. I read it in the column in the New York Times proposed by Roderick McFarquhar of Harvard University. And he said that if you really want to give China an incentive, a carrot, to find a solution to the Korean Peninsula, then what other parties can propose is that if in the event of a reunification of the Korean Peninsula, the reunified Korea would not be an ally of the United States, but would be an independent, neutral state. And therefore, there's no danger of the United States, of China contributing to the reunification of a Korean Peninsula that leads to an ally right on China's borders. Now, that's an idea that Professor Roderick McFarquhar has proposed. Now, of course, the big question is, number one, whether it's acceptable to the United States, but more importantly, is it acceptable to the people of Korea? Would the people of Korea want to see this, or would they not want to see this? What's their views on this? And I suggest this because clearly, given how dangerous the situation has become, we must look for more of such out-of-the-box solutions if you're going to make sure that you avoid a military conflict and actually nudge the correlation of forces towards a peaceful solution. And maybe as part of the way of nudging the way towards a peaceful solution, you suggest this out-of-the-box solutions.
on the role of the United States in Korean Peninsula, especially in terms of whether U.S. is at the center of their hostility vis-a-vis North Korea. Roughly speaking, I'd like to buy your idea, but please think about one incident. During the sinking of Cheonan naval ships and Yeonpyeong Island, the artillery case, it is a great violation, a very serious one, recently happened. But at that time, the U.S. forces never mobilized. So there is some rumor that even U.S. side, discouraged any escalation of the conflict. So I personally have some resistance on the argument that the role of Korea, U.S. the U.S. Central role in antagonizing North Korea. So maybe so I need some careful the observation on based on what actually happened in Korean Peninsula. Okay.
Okay, regarding Chinese proposal, so-called freeze to freeze, I think that is somewhat far away from the reality in my assessment, because I think ROK-US joint military exercise is really meaningful and viable strategic leverage. I think that is the only leverage we have vis-a-vis North Korea. The reason why North Korea is so sensitive to our joint military exercise is that full-scale kind of a military exercises together with, for example, the strategic asset deployment of the United States, the aircraft carriers are coming, the B-1B and the B-2, B-52, these kind of strategic bombers are coming, and we drill together Korean soldiers and U.S. soldiers. This kind of military exercises could be turned into a real military attack on North Korea. That is what North Korea is afraid of. If we do not actually use force, if we do not implement real military attack on North Korea, I think that this kind of a strategic card should be maintained to make our aspiration for dialogue stronger and consolidated. Otherwise, if we give up this card, I think from the South Korean point of view, our strategic card will be evaporating. So I think this proposal is actually disarming the U.S. ROK combined capability. So that's why I oppose. And the second question about the three options I mentioned in terms of Plan B, when our diplomatic efforts are totally exhausted, or even before appear to be being exhausted, I think we need to discuss those three options. Completion of a nuclear fuel cycle is if I paraphrase, is getting close to the Japanese model. Okay, Japan has a reprocessing capability while ROK doesn't. So as long as we want to continue to rely on U.S.-provided nuclear umbrella, I think Korea, at least, need to acquire reprocessing capability, which means the completion of a nuclear fuel cycle if we do not want to transform it into real nuclear weapons. Redeployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, I think this is not to be quite welcomed by the United States, but if we are really getting serious about North Korean nuclear problem, I think that moment will come for us to discuss this option too. Otherwise, South Korean people, the ordinary people, will continue to suspect the U.S. extended deterrence because of geographical distance between Korean Peninsula and Guam and the mainland of the United States. They don't understand how nuclear umbrella is provided for the Korean people. So geographical proximity still matters for the ordinary people, if not experts. And the last option obviously will create strongest opposition from the international pressure. So that's why I mentioned in that order in terms of the level of resistance from the international community. Thank you.
More than 20 questions. So, but I will try to digest, roughly speaking, all of them. First question addressed to Professor Jia Jingguo. Chinese government, while participating in student sanctions against North Korea, has been reluctant to tighten the grip for fear of North Korean regime collapsing. But the crisis and the danger has now reached the point where the security of Chinese people itself are threatened. How does the Chinese people view the current situation, and would this alter the direction of the Chinese government? The second issue is, what do you think of the most viable option? What do you think of the decapitation, decapitation, of the Kim Jong-un as most viable options? So that is another question. And other question is, what is the role of the EU, the NATO charters? Any attack on the members of NATO might be perceived as the attack on all NATO members. So what if North Korea attack, Guam? So it will, invoke all participation of all NATO members. That is maybe this might very preliminary question, but I hope anybody could respond to my question. And the other question is that if international community take action of the maritime bloc, how China will respond to such the maritime bloc? So that is addressed to the Professor Jia Jingguo.
How to respond to North Korea's nuclear issue is a very controversial topic in China. We have people with very different views. Some people still strongly believe that we should not do anything about North Korea. Actually, they don't even like China participating in the UN sanctions against North Korea. For this group of people, the U.S. is our enemy. So our enemy's enemy is our friend. So North Korea is our asset that can be used, to dilute, if not completely, negate U.S. policy of containment of China. Okay, in their eyes, U.S. is trying to contain China because China is the rising power, U.S. is the established one. And also there are people who are ideologically poised to believe that we should not help the U.S. Capitalist power. If you make the argument that we should consult with the U.S. To make sure that we don't bump into each other, like I just made an argument, I became the target of their criticism. But of course, I think, but most people in the foreign policy community, most people probably would agree that we need to take a pragmatic approach. We need to talk to the Americans, talk to the South Koreans, talk to other people to find ways to address this problem. North Korea nuclear threat is not just the US problem, it's also China's problem. We need to work together to manage this problem instead of working separately. On regime change, I think China has consistently opposed to regime change because China doesn't believe that this is the right way to address a problem. Okay, China, in principle, believes that we should adhere to the principle of non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs, and regime change is the extreme version of international intervention in other countries' internal affairs. It is important for us to persuade North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. This is the critical issue. Okay? What North Korea cares about is regime change. I mean, national security, that's a different thing. Regime survival is the top priority of North Korea. Okay? So if you cannot assure them of this priority, they will never give up nuclear weapons. Okay? And you cannot just say that, offhandedly, that we are not going to have a regime change with North Korea. You have to be serious about this. Okay? And the U.S. has discredited itself on this in the Libyan case. Okay? So this time, if you really want North Korea to give up nuclear weapons, you have to be very serious. Okay? Maybe we should have an international treaty on this if North Korea can give up nuclear weapons. And decapitation option, I think it probably won't work because this is a case involving nuclear weapons. Okay? And also involving probably around 10,000 pieces of artillery pointing at Seoul. Okay? Decapitation probably it will not solve the problem. Instead, it probably would unleash a North Korean attack on South Korea especially. I mean, if you want to have decapitation, if it's considered, it should be accompanied by a massive attack to take out the first strike capabilities of North Korea. But that's war. Okay, it's not decapitation anymore. Okay. Finally, marine bloc also depends on North Korea's behavior. If it continues to push forward its nuclear and missile programs, I think sooner or later we are going to reach this stage in which whether we have to seriously consider blocking maritime block or total cut-off nuclear supply. Energy supply to North Korea. Thank you.
Address to the Japanese colleague. Within Japan, excluding the North Korean nuclear armament, I mean, is there any sensitivity that South Korean nuclear armament could be threat to Japan. Do you agree with Mr. Park's, myself, argument that we are not on the eve of the, we are not in the situation of conundrum, we are on the eve of catastrophe. I agree with that idea. And then, in that case, what we should do as of now, as a tactical, as a more tangible measures. And second, many scholars and analysts are now more dismissive of the idea of international community. How can this idea make a comeback and gain strength, especially in the context of North Korea? Maybe you may say that on the viability of the five-party talk or something like that.
The question, I believe, was whether there's an alarm in Japan about nuclear development in South Korea, not North Korea. And my simple answer would be that no. There is very little recognition of even the debate or discussion about the nuclear option in South Korea. In Japan, the discussion about the nuclear option is one about national security in general, that Japan has been a weak power. It's about some time that we become a major power. I have all the words that I can say right now, but I'll stop here because I disagree with this. Japan is a major power, by the way, good or bad. And the second point is about China. Now, when discussions about going nuclear in South Korea is recognized in Japan, this could be a major challenge. It hasn't happened yet, and it shouldn't happen. I'll end here.
I know we're running over, so I won't really say anything that lengthy, but I would just say that there was one question about the international community, and I do think there is a role for the international community. We should be thinking about it, using it as one of our images of what's going on here. There clearly is a worldwide constituency for reducing the role of nuclear weapons, for trying to remove this dreadful and truly catastrophic form of violence from our lives. It was all those years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki where the first and only atomic weapons were dropped, and there was in the ensuing decades the rise of a kind of taboo or a delegitimacy of this weapon. There was a threshold. Even other weapons that were so-called conventional but yet equally capable as nuclear weapons are were different. There was something about going to that next threshold. And it seems to me that we've lost some of that when we have leaders who talk about using nuclear weapons to solve the problem of nuclear weapons, to risking the killing of 1 million people to save the killing of 1 million people. There's a kind of deep irrationality of this and danger in all of this. And so there might be an upside of stimulating, renewing the international community's movement towards pushing back, towards ridding the world of nuclear weapons. I think the Global Zero movement and the recent United Nations vote on elimination, the so-called ban treaty, are getting a new lease on life. So I think in the background there will be a kind of dialectical process here where we will try to remind our leaders that that they are the safeguard leaders of this awful technology, and they need to find a way to pull themselves back from the brink, remembering, like Robert Oppenheimer recalled in his very vivid imagery of two states looking at each other with nuclear weapons is like two scorpions in a bottle. There is no winner. And so the international community, I think, needs to be the conscience of the world and to reanimate the taboo and delegitimate understanding of this weapon. And that's an assignment, I think, for all of us who are members of international community.
I misplaced one interesting question addressed to Professor Mabuba니. So, in my perspective, sanction to work if it is properly exerted. Different from the Iranian issue, there has been no secondary sanction to the North Korea, which would make North Korea seriously hurt. U.S. should take the risk of escalation with initiating the secondary sanction for making the North Korea to feel the security threat and come to the negotiation table. So that is another counter-argument.
I think if you want to debate the issue of sanctions, you'll be here for the next few hours. It's a very long, complicated issue. But I'll emphasize there is a big difference between multilateral sanctions. And the reason why Iran, at the end of the day, signed a deal is because of multilateral sanctions from the UN Security Council, which every country had to implement against Iran. And that's why, at the end of the day, Iran, as you know, decided to sign the deal. But at the same time, talking of Iran, I must say that any decision by the United States to walk away from the Iran deal will then send North Korea a signal that doesn't matter what deal you sign, the United States can walk away from that deal. So actually, it's very important for the United States to stick to the Iran deal if it wants to send a compelling argument to North Korea that we'll respect the deals that we'll reach with you. But just very quickly to add to one or two points. One time, I must say, what has come out in the discussion is the layers of complexity of this problem. There are many, many layers of complexity, but there are two more layers that we should also talk about. The next layer of complexity that actually hasn't been fully addressed, because Jia Qingko said that some people in China say that North Korea is a friend of China, and therefore we should, enemy of our enemy is our friend. Actually, the relations between China and North Korea, from what I can tell, have never been worse. And in fact, what is unusual is that President Xi Jinping has, as far as I know, never met Kim Jong-un. That's very unusual. In the history of China-North Korea relations, the leaders have always met. This time they have not met. And that reflects the depth of suspicion between North Korea and China. And that, of course, also explains why North Korea, in a sense, is pushing for the nuclear option. Because in theory, if North Korea trusted China to protect North Korea, it doesn't need nuclear weapons. But because it has a lack of trust towards China, it says, okay, I have to protect myself. And then the second layer of complexity that we have to bring into the discussion is that, if indeed North Korean nuclear weapons trigger Japanese nuclear weapons and South Korean nuclear weapons, the biggest loser, I think, will be China. Because China will then have to deal with a much more dangerous neighborhood on its doorstep. And that actually explains why China is actually deeply concerned about the North Korean nuclear issue, not so much about the North Korean nuclear weapon per se, but the impact it has in creating a nuclear neighborhood, which of course then definitely will impact on China's national security and create a much more complicated national security environment for China. So that's another layer of complexity at the beginning. But the final point, and here I want to strongly endorse what John just said, is that we are in danger, by and large, of course with a few exceptions, Israel, Pakistan, India, and so on and so forth. By and large, we have actually succeeded in our overall battle against nuclear proliferation. The conventional wisdom in the 1950s and 60s was that by the 60s and 70s, there would be about 25 to 30 nuclear weapon states, Argentina, Brazil, Turkey, and so on and so forth. But actually, we did succeed in putting the cork into the nuclear bottle, and it only allowed just basically 3 or 4 countries to escape from that. So by and large, having succeeded in the battle against nuclear proliferation globally, if indeed the North Korean nuclear weapons trigger Japan and South Korean nuclear, then trust me, many other countries are going to follow. The Turkeys, the Brazils, the Argentinas will say, okay, why not me? And therefore, the role of the international community is therefore even more important now, because they've got to understand that the stakes here don't just involve 2-3 states, the stakes here involve the world at large.
I just want to say one final thing to my dear friend Jing Guo, the leader of the Chinese Democratic Party. I'm joking. Yeah. China, I think.
I hope your Democratic Party is more successful than mine.
Yeah, I hope so. Then China will change. Okay. I think China is looking at North Korea through the lens of Chinese-U.S. strategic competition. That's why you are not able to isolate North Korean problem from the rest of other strategic issues, such as East China Sea or South China Sea, and many more strategic issues. So your leaders' thinking is that these all issues are interlinked to each other. That's why enemies, friends. That kind of a zero-sum mentality is emerging, getting strengthened. I don't think it is quite constructive, even for China. If China shows genuine cooperation and shows one of the biggest contribution to resolving the North Korean nuclear problem, I think that is going to be the big strategic turning point for China. Since that time on, China will hold kind of upper hand in dealing with the rest of the other regional strategic issues.
Thank you. We spent almost 2.5 hours. So I really respect, all my friends, the patience and some, attention to these important issues. If I give just one word, Korean people survived 5,000 years. There's too many crises and terrible challenges. Sometimes from outside, sometimes from inside. The most formidable enemy is not North Korea, not nuclear powers. I think the most terrible enemy is any fear within ourselves. We should have confidence. We are good exemplary case, achieved great prosperity and peace in the world. So let's cheer up ourselves. Thank you.